After the midterm, we're going to begin a section on equilibrium, reactions that happen in equilibrium. Typically, we abbreviate equilibrium EQ. Right, so chapter 14 is going to focus on gas equilibrium and some of the basics. Chapters 15 and 16 will be about acids and bases, as well as the equilibrium that is specific to those types of reactions. We'll also talk about buffers and biological systems, which exist in acid-base equilibrium. It may be that we choose to have 2 quizzes in this next unit before we get to chapter 17 and 18. The way it may work is we'll have a short quiz with 14 and then possibly a quiz with chapters 15 and 16 combined. The length of the quiz will still be the same. It'll be probably 10 questions. So I'll give you those dates when we meet in class next. This is a picture of the protein hemoglobin. We're going to look more at the equilibrium of this molecule. If we think about reactions that happen in the laboratory, we have some that will go only in one direction. So you can take a compound and make the product, but you can't easily reverse. So it's not easily reversed. In biological systems, it makes sense for reactions to go in both directions, or in equilibrium. And you'll see the arrow shown 2 ways, like this, or with 2 arrows. Okay, a little bit more about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a 4 subunit protein. And I'll just circle each of those subunits. Well, this is a microscopic structure. We would not know what it looks like if it weren't for X-ray crystallography, or another way to look at that is X-ray diffraction. In this case, light is shined on these molecules, and just like anything that can reflect light, the light will then bounce back. And so a computer will take all of the different diffraction patterns and turn that into a 3-dimensional shape. You can also get at the 3-dimensional shape from NMR, which is something you'll learn more about in organic chemistry if you take that. Okay, looking at this molecule in a little bit more detail, you can see that there are 4 of these molecules that is shown in red and blue and white here, and that is heme. This is the part of hemoglobin that carries the oxygen. It has an iron atom associated with that heme. And depending on the oxidation state of iron, this will determine the color of hemoglobin and consequently the color of blood. So let's look more at the hemoglobin equilibrium and how it carries oxygen. Here is an equation representing the hemoglobin equilibrium and oxygen binding. Okay, so we have to think about 2 different places in the body, the lungs and in the extremities or in the muscles. Okay, looking at this reaction here, hemoglobin is abbreviated HB. Okay, so on the left-hand side, shown here, that represents hemoglobin not bound with oxygen. Okay, and you know that because the plus sign is shown there, showing that you have oxygen separate from hemoglobin. On the right-hand side, we have HbO2, which stands for the bound hemoglobin. Bound with oxygen. Okay, so this is one of those circumstances where it's good for the equilibrium, the reaction to occur in equilibrium, because there are times when hemoglobin is transported back to the lungs and it does not have oxygen. It's delivered the oxygen to the muscles. So when it goes back to the lungs, you have more Hb. And you want those proteins to be able to pick up the oxygen in the lungs and carry it back to the muscles. And so in that case, it'd be HbO2. Right? So you want both forms to be available in the body, and you want the reaction to be able to go in both directions. Both binding oxygen going in the forward direction, and just circle that part right there, binding the oxygen, and then the reverse, delivering the oxygen to places that need it. Okay, so we're looking at this reaction. You'll see here, shown in the box here, that in the lungs there is high oxygen. And so what happens is that there is more oxygen. Oxygen is available to bind. And so when we add more reactant, add R, that is going to shift the equilibrium in the forward direction or to the right. So we could say forward or right. Okay, so all of the red blood cells that are carrying hemoglobin from the muscles back to the lungs, at that point you have the Hb alone, oxygen concentration is high, the hemoglobin bind oxygen, and are now ready to go back from the lungs to the muscles and carry that oxygen with them. Okay, now we have hemoglobin with oxygen bound to it that has picked up oxygen in the lungs and it's carrying it back to the muscles. In the muscle, there is low oxygen concentration. So that is like removing reactant. So when that happens, that is going to cause the reaction to shift back to the left or in the reverse direction. Okay, so now the hemoglobin is releasing the oxygen. One part that is not shown here, what happens is that myoglobin, which is sort of a sister protein to hemoglobin, picks up the oxygen and holds on to it in the muscles. And the way you can look at it is M for muscle. And so the oxygen is now available for the muscles when they need to go through aerobic respiration, more specifically, oxidative phosphorylation, which you'll learn more about in biochemistry. I should note that the principles that govern which direction the equilibrium will shift are called Le Chatelier's principle, which we'll talk about a little bit more in our discussion of chapter 14. When we look at the hemoglobin equilibrium, I'll just write that here up at the top. One of the coolest applications of this has to do with fetal hemoglobin. When a woman or a mammal is pregnant, The baby is connected to the mother through the placenta. And the placenta has these small capillaries where the maternal and the fetal blood will exchange. So we have fetal blood and maternal blood. And the actual hemoglobin molecule, fetal hemoglobin, is different in structure as compared to maternal hemoglobin. The cool thing about that is it has greater affinity for oxygen than maternal hemoglobin. So when the blood reaches the placenta, the equilibrium is driven in the reverse direction because the oxygen pressure is low. Oxygen pressure is low in the placenta. All right, so that's going to drive the equilibrium back to the left, and the adult or the maternal hemoglobin will release the oxygen, and the fetal hemoglobin will pick that up. As I said, it has greater affinity for oxygen, so it holds on to it. And this is the way that oxygen is delivered to the baby in the womb. One of the things that we will discuss in class in a little more detail is the equilibrium constant. In class, I'm going to show you something called the equilibrium simulator. And we'll look at what happens on a molecular level. We'll model what is happening on a molecular level and talk about the ratio of C and D and A and B. Okay, so to look at this reaction represented here, K is the equilibrium constant. You'll see a lot of different equilibriums. Kw, which is water equilibrium. And this is very important when we consider the pH scale. Ka, which is an acid equilibrium. Kb, which is base equilibrium. And we'll look at those in more detail in chapters 15 and 16. If we're talking about a generic equivalent, it would be Keq. In this chapter, we'll also see Kc and Kp, which stands for chemical and pressure equilibrium. In the next section, in the problem solving, we'll look at how to convert back and forth with these two equilibrium values. All right, so let me erase for just a moment here. And let's take this expression for K and write it in reverse, or write the reaction. In the case of the equilibrium constant, we always look at products over reactants. And the little exponents here represent the mole ratio. It's the number that's in front when you balance the reaction. So looking at this, I could write the reaction little a, big A, plus little b, big B, goes to little c, big C, plus little d, big D. All right, so when we're talking about writing the expression for the reaction, all we're doing is writing this equilibrium formula. So that's the first thing that we're going to learn how to do. Later on, we will solve problems using the equilibrium constant and different concentrations of C, D, A, and B. One of the things that I need to point out about equilibrium constants is we only include gases, or things in the gas phase, and things that are aqueous. So that's why we talk about chemical equilibrium, Kc, and pressure equilibriums, Kp. So if something is in the solid, a pure solid or a pure liquid, we do not count that in the equilibrium expression. You can go through and look at the math, but essentially they don't contribute to KEQ, and so we focus on the things that make the most difference in the expression. All right, we have an equilibrium reaction shown here. Hydrogen plus bromine gas go to 2 hydrogen bromide, and you see the phase of these is in, they're all three in the gas phase, so consequently all three are included in the K expression. So our product, hydrogen bromide, we have 2 of those, note that, and also note that we see that shown in the exponent. So the mole ratio is the exponent. In the case of hydrogen and bromine, there's 1 of each, so we do not have to show 1. That is assumed. All right, in this case, I can actually count the molecules in the picture and calculate KEQ. We'll assume that this system is at equilibrium. Right, we're shown up here what the molecule of hydrogen bromide looks like, so we'll just count those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, so I plug that in, 9 squared on top. And then down at the bottom I have 1 hydrogen and 1 bromine. So I put 1 in each of those. Then I go ahead and solve the math. 9 squared is 81. 1 times 1 is 1. So K is equal to 81. This is a relatively large number. So in other words, if K is greater than 1, this usually means that there are more products than reactants. So that tells us about the direction of the equilibrium. So in this particular instance, the forward reaction is favored. So forward is favored because I'm going to have more products than reactants. Let's look at another example. We have nitrogen gas plus oxygen gas go to 2 nitrogen monoxide. So when I'm writing the equilibrium expression, the concentration of nitrogen monoxide gets squared, and then we have the concentration of nitrogen times oxygen on the bottom of the fraction, the denominator. All right, so let's go ahead and solve K for this reaction. I'm going to count the red-blue combined here. There's 1, 2. So I plug that in, 2 squared over. Right, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 nitrogen. Put those there. And then I have 1, 2, 3, 4 oxygen. That goes there. So the 2 squared is 4 divided by 24. And when I go ahead and solve that fraction, I get 0.17. So now we have an opposite case where K is less than 1. So in this circumstance, there are more reactants than products, and I'll just put P there. So the opposite is true. The reverse reaction is favored. So reverse favored. Let's look at an example problem now. We're going to, in the first example here, we're going to write the equilibrium expression. In the second part, we're going to write the balanced equations. Right, so let's take a look at these in more detail. Now, I have to apologize for the way the reaction comes out. It doesn't always show the same detail as we see in PowerPoint. Okay, so I have 2 carbon monoxide plus oxygen goes to 2 carbon dioxide. Notice that all 3 are all in the gas phase, so each of these will be in our equilibrium expression. Right, so I'm just going to write the formula. KEQ is equal to products over reactants, carbon dioxide squared, because there are 2 of them, over carbon monoxide squared times oxygen squared. I'm sorry, not squared. Right, so we just written a formula that we can do calculations with later if needed. Now let's look at A and B of the second part. In this case, we have the equilibrium constant provided, the formula for it. So in this case, it's H2 squared times S2 over dihydrogen sulfide squared. All right, so in this case, I'm just going to write a balanced reaction. Products over reactants, and the exponent is the mole ratio. So I have 2 hydrogen sulfide, this is in equilibrium, goes to 2 hydrogen plus sulfur, and that's S2. We would assume all of these are in the gas phase. All right, so I could add that bit of detail if I wanted to. If I did it correctly, then the reaction should balance. I have 4 hydrogen on both sides. Okay, so we're good there. 4 hydrogen and 2 times 1 sulfur, 2 sulfur, so we are good. It is balanced. All right, I'm going to erase that one, and we'll look at the third example here. All right, in this case we have K is equal to COCl2 over, let me go ahead and put that in, COCl2 over carbon monoxide times chlorine. All right, very good. Same thing, product is on top, so carbon monoxide gas plus chlorine goes to, and that's equilibrium, COCl2. And if I did it correctly, it should be balanced. All right, so I can write the equilibrium expression from a balanced reaction, or I can write a balanced reaction from the equilibrium expression. In 14-1 activity, you'll practice doing exactly this, where you're writing the equilibrium expression if given the reaction. On the next video, which will be primarily problem solving, we'll go ahead and work some problems with KEQ and with the individual concentrations.